Wilson here. Today we're talking to my friend Krista Goldstine Cole. Krista, after being rejected by a local university, somehow decided that she really ought to go to Harvard. We're going to talk about what it took to get into Harvard, why she would move into the dorms at age 47, the cast of characters she met, what it was like to rub shoulders with the 1%, what did she learn, and since she's an expert, we're going to ask her how we help the kids. I hope you enjoy the show. If you want to, please visit me at adamehwilson.com. Throw some support my way, or go to YouTube, my channel there, same, Adam E.H. Wilson, and like, subscribe, tell your family, tell your friends. Thanks for listening, and away we go. All right, I am here with Krista Goldstine Cole, and we are going to talk about awesome things. But I appreciate you being here, Krista. It's been a while, and I always like to start by asking, where are you from originally? Where did little Krista come from?
That is the hardest question you will ask today. My father was in the Army, so I like to say that I am from everywhere and from nowhere. So I was actually born in Germany, and I went to my first 3 years of school in Germany, and then we moved to the States. So when my dad left the Army, adolescent Krista and family moved to Colorado, and my family's been there ever since. But I left for college and stayed in Washington, which is how I met you.
Oh, okay. So you were a little kid in Germany, but on a base?
So sometimes we were on the base, and sometimes we weren't. There was the last place that we lived when I was in elementary school. There were quarters for officers that were separated from everything else. So I lived with other officers' children, but like to go to school, we had to get on the bus and drive through, German areas and then go through the gates, which actually turned out to be an interesting proposition because it was the 70s and the Munich Olympics had happened, and then there was this huge wave of bombings that happened in Germany after that that were targeted specifically at Americans. So some of my keenest memories as a little kid were actually going to first and second grade and having the bus stop at the gate, and then having MPs like run mirrors under the bus to check for bombs, and walk through the bus and look for bombs and talk to 8-year-olds about bombs. It was I don't know that it was developmentally appropriate.
Yeah. That is interesting. Yeah. And what was it? Did you have a lot of interaction then with like little German kids, or mostly fellow military kids? What?
Mostly fellow American military kids. Although my parents were both bilingual, and so they would make an effort to connect us to German families that they knew. My German was not particularly good, but the most fascinating thing about it is my parents insisted that we speak German at the dinner table. So my German around food was quite good. And the last time I was in Germany, I took my daughter a few years ago. I don't know, it must be like 4 years now. And everyone just speaks to me in German. They just assume that I'm German. They don't assume that I'm American, which is funny because everywhere else in Europe, everyone just knows I'm American. And I cannot navigate any of it except in a restaurant. Like, if you give me a menu, I can tell you.
Well, honestly, That, and if you can ask where the bathroom is, that's the first thing you learn in any language is
Yeah.
how to order at the restaurant, man.
Yes. And I can ask where the bathroom
All
is
right.
well. I also, whenever I travel,
All right.
because I get lost really easily. So the other thing I learned in every language before I go anywhere is, uh, I don't speak your language and I am lost. So like several years ago, I went to Brazil. I learned how to say these things in Portuguese. I cannot say anything in those. I mean, I can't speak any Portuguese at this point, and I could not repeat those sentences. But in preparation for traveling to Brazil, I learned to say, "I am lost. Please help me."
Perfectly, with no accent. I am lost. That's funny. We could do a whole show on travel tips later. But I'll catch up to. So we worked together for a while at the state senate in Washington, and I love this. This is where we should jump off because you were working on how to get into college, and you were a grown person. Let's be fair. This was not too long ago.
Well,
So, go tell me first of all why you're going to go back to college. You've been to college, but you're going back. So let's start there.
okay. Well, first, because one needs an exit from the Washington State Senate. I mean, that is a tough and harrowing job, and at some point, you need an exit, right? And so that was the primary reason. So let's just be upfront about this. Like, I will just drop the H bomb and then we will move on. So I went to Harvard to get my doctorate. And the reason I ended up at Harvard is honestly because Seattle University did not take me. So,
Yes, I understand. That happens to people all the time, by the way.
so I applied to Seattle U, and they sent me this email that said, "Oh, we're very sorry. We've decided to revamp our program, and so we're not going to look at your application." And I said, "But you cashed my check for $80. Can I have my $80 back?" And they said, "No." And I said, "Okay, can you apply the $80 to next year when you'll actually look at the application?" And they said, "No." And I was like really mad, right? So I said to my husband, "I think I need a better school." And through a series of events over a few weeks, he was like, "You should go to Harvard." Like, wait, what? He's like, "What are you talking about? This is insane." And so, but I applied to Harvard, and they took me. So off I went at age 47 to begin again. I did not.
Yeah.
My daughter, my youngest child, so I have 3 kids. My youngest child started undergrad classes on the same day that I started classes for my doctorate, and so we tracked through together. And I should say, right before I left,
That is amazing.
right before I left, I got an email from Seattle U saying, "Hello, our program is back up and running. We would like to apply your $80 to your application. Would you like to update your application?" And I sent an email back, and I can imagine like just having an endless deluge of emails after that, right? So I want to put an end to it. So I wrote back and I said, "Well, thank you very much, but I will be attending Harvard Graduate School of Education in the fall." And they they replied, which is a single line that said, "Harvard? Question mark. Really?"
Can we call them? We have some thoughts to share with them. Wow. Okay. Well, you're skipping over an important part here, which is where you did. So you're like sitting around. Dang it, Seattle U, which is a great university. I've heard nothing bad about Seattle University, except for that they we're slow to give you back your $80. First knock on Seattle U. But then you're like, well, if I can't get in there, I'll just go to Harvard. I mean, like, it's like an entire thing. It's like I think we can say that it is an elite school. I think we're safe in calling Harvard an elite institution. So what kind of hurdles are we talking about? Just quick, what's it like when you're like, oh, I'll go to Harvard?
Yeah, I that is such a great. See, you stumped me, Adam. So let me think back. I only
You don't
applied to
even know
Harvard.
the answer.
I only applied to Harvard. I think it was because in my mind, I just decided that I was going to get in. I also thought it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever done, right? Like, my husband was like, you really should apply to Harvard. And then I met a woman who had gotten her PhD at midlife from Yale. And I met her at a luncheon thing, or it was a bunch of ladies having lunch together. And she was sort of new to the group, and she was sort of telling her story. No one at the table knew that I had applied to Seattle U. No one knew that I had been rejected by Seattle U, and no one knew I was thinking in this direction. And so she was telling her story, and she said, the thing is that when you go for a doctorate at midlife, you have to go to a one named university like a Harvard or a Yale or an Oxford. Otherwise, people won't take you seriously. They'll just think it's a midlife crisis. So I didn't think of myself I was 46, I think, at the time. I didn't think of myself as being midlife. Like, why would you have a midlife crisis at 46? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me, right?
Right.
So
I'm going to be living to 120, so that's like when I'm 60.
Right, exactly. So, so I went home and I told my husband that story, and he was like, "So what are the one named schools in your field?" And I was like, "Well, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, probably." And so Stanford was really not a very good match for me. And Columbia was really funny because I went to their website and, like, I don't know, it wasn't working that day, and I couldn't navigate it, and it was weird, and I couldn't find the information that I needed, and whatever. So I thought, well, this is crazy. So I went to the Harvard website, and they do have a doctoral program at Harvard that is free, 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 free. And I was like, free is a good price. I like free. But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah,
I
I'm with you there.
I didn't believe it was true, right? So I said to my husband, okay, look, Harvard seems to have this free program. So can you, like, make sure it's really free? Because I don't want to go down this path and then find out that it's, $65,000 a year or something. Like, no.
Yeah. I don't want to be one of those like subscription things where I signed up for 90 days and now I'm
Sure, just re-up my credit card for another 10 grand. So yeah, I said, so go find out. And so he did. He came back, and he came back with the original press release um, when they had announced the program, the endowment for the program. And he said, look, it's really free, really, really free. I'm like, okay. I mean, it turns out that was their leadership doctorate program, and it wasn't, it didn't have a research component. And so I was like, I don't think that's the right program for me. But, as it turns out, most elite schools that have endowments, you don't pay tuition when you're a doc student. If you go to a public university, you do, but if you go to any private university, you're not going to be paying tuition for your doctorate. So, it's sort of free in that sense. So I went ahead and applied for the research program.
okay.
Which, from the other side, from the professional side, what happened was that when I was at the Senate, I worked on the policy side, and senators would walk into my office and they would ask me these crazy questions that I couldn't answer. And the last one was just this question about how do you solve the problem of truancy, which is an age old educational problem no one has an answer to.
Truancy, yes, right. Being not going to school, right?
Right.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I mean, the problem with truancy is that a gateway to all kinds of bad outcomes. Not for every kid that skipped school. I mean, I skipped a lot of school and didn't end up in prison. But if you go the other way, if you talk to people who were in prison and go back the other way, they all describe, being absent from school, being truant from school a lot. So from a public
Being
policy
truant.
perspective,
And that's going to check out too, right? Like I'm going to look up your criminal record and it's going to be clean.
oh,
Okay.
mine?
All right. As
I
long
don't
as
know
that's
why you
cool.
expect that of me.
Yeah, yours. Just asking because you were truant a lot. Okay.
Yeah. So
But they ask
decided
you, okay, so how do we fix
oh,
this? Because we want no more kids in prison. Yeah, okay.
yeah. Yeah, that's actually for a long time. That was the theory of change in Washington. Is that if you look inside of adult prisons, everybody, 73% of people in adult prison in Washington State came through the juvenile justice system, right? So the theory of change for the longest time was that what we need to do is we need to stop we need to prevent entry into the juvenile justice system, and then for kids who end up in the juvenile justice system, we need to do a better job of treating underlying issues like substance use or mental health disorder, so that they don't recidivate into adult prison. It's a good theory of change. It just takes really a long time. It takes a generation for you to be able to see the results. But Washington did close both a juvenile detention facility and 2 or 3 prisons in 2011. So it was a starting it was starting to take off. But then there was this next level of how do we keep kids in school? And aside from the answer of make it interesting, it's a complex question, right?
Yes, absolutely. But so you're like, I'll go get a PhD and get back to you? Is that
Yeah, pretty much. When I told a particular senator that I was leaving, he was very, very, very unhappy. And he was like, "Why? Why would you leave me for Harvard? Why would you do that?" Um, and so we had this funny conversation, and then he went away. And a few days later, he came back and he's like, "I've decided that you're very smart. This will be very useful to me. Go find the answers and come back."
Yes. Okay, this is okay with me now. You go and get my answer and then come back. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but
It
then
sounds
he
like the same,
retired. So,
honestly.
what? Like, this is completely unfair to change the rules like that.
Nice. Okay. So, but look, so you found a free you have a question. You're going to make sure all the kids go to school and you're maybe going to have to pay a little bit. But did you have to see somebody? Did you have to join the Skull and Bones Club? Is that Yale? That might be it. Anyway, what happens next?
What happens next? So, actually, let me just say at the front end, they've completely changed the admissions process now. So this is not how it works. And I am 100% certain I would not be admitted to Harvard if I had to go through the current process. So, the next thing is you have to take those crazy tests, right? You have to take the GREs. And yeah, like it was no problem for me on the language side, but on the math side, like going back and trying to remember geometry, it's like crazy hard. And it should have been a clue, right? Like it should have been a clue uh, that I think I scored like in the 50th percentile or maybe in the 60th percentile, but certainly not what you like, not the sort of myth ethos of any of the elite schools that you could get in with that kind of score on a GRE. So when I got my GRE scores, I cried and I was like, okay, they're not going to take me. And I went back to work. And literally,
oh, that's sad. Okay.
literally, applications are due like the 1st of December. And they told us that we would hear by the end of March, right? So I was just like, I have no control over this. I didn't tell anyone that I had done it. I just, let it go. and moved on. And then one day I was actually in the governor's office meeting about cuts because I worked social services, right? And the cuts were like $86 million. Like, this is not a trivial amount of money, right? So, we're having this conversation about cutting $86 million from public assistance. And my phone rang, and it had a 617, area code, and I was like, I don't know who that is. And so I didn't take the call. So then I had a voicemail, and I was reading the voicemail because I got like a printout of the voicemail on my phone. So I was like reading it, and then
Right.
I literally bumped into someone who needed to not see that email. So I like clicked off the screen, and in doing that, I completely lost the voicemail. So I didn't know what the punchline was. I didn't know.
This is Harvard University. We have something important to tell.
So I went back to my office, and I was like, okay, you're smart enough to figure this out. What do you do? And then I was like, oh, I have caller ID. I'll just, so I just dialed the number back. So I had rejected the call of them calling to say that they had accepted me, which I guess they do. They call everyone. So for me, it was just you sent out an application. The biggest part of it, you have to write an essay, and the other really big part of it is that you have to have your transcripts. And so, because I was old and middle-aged, all my transcripts were not digitized, right, in a digital world. For me, figuring out how you get them what they want, because my transcripts are old enough that the undergraduate university that I attended, University of Puget Sound, just they don't digitize that far back.
Wow.
What do you
That's
do?
funny. Well, okay. Well, you're making this sound like very much like you're applying. We just had to apply to get our kid, fill out the paperwork for the youngest to go to preschool. And this is what you're making. Well, you fill out the form and you get your transcript. You write a little letter, like, this is why I want to go to Harvard. And then you're in. Okay, fine, good. I'm glad that it's that simple. Somebody should have told us all. So you should tell us, though, because you did. Let's talk about this. So you get in because clearly you are very well qualified and very thoughtful, and you're out there doing good for the kids of the world. But you didn't go to grad school the way most of us go to grad school if we're going to do that later in life, which is to go online or go on the weekend, or it's the leadership management seminar. You packed your bags and went back to college at 47. Tell me about.
Yeah.
Was that an option? Was that a choice? Yeah. How did that?
So all along, when my husband convinced me that that I should apply to Harvard, he said, "I'll go with you. It'll be fine. We'll send our daughter off to college, and I'll go with you, and it'll be great." And so then I get this call, and we went out with a friend who is a very good lawyer to celebrate. We're still trying to keep it on the down low because the legislative session was going on. It was budget negotiations. It was not a good time to start saying I'm leaving, right? No. So we went out, and this friend is a very good lawyer and says to my husband, "Hey, what's going to happen now? Are you moving to Boston?" He's like, "Oh no, I decided not to." Wait, what? What? And this friend knew that he had promised me this whole time, and he was a very good lawyer, so he just started cross-examining me. "So how's that going to work, and what do you have in mind?" And I was like, "What is happening here?" So later.
Allow me to. Yes, I have a few questions, Your Honor. The witness here at the dinner table. Okay.
So I waited till the weekend, and then I was like, "So was that your way of saying we're getting divorced or something?" And he was like, "Oh, no, I've just decided." And I was like, "No, wait, you told me you told me that you would go to Boston with me. What are you doing? And he said, I changed my mind.
I seem to recall, this now that you're mentioning it, because I think that you may have brought this concern with you to work, and you're like, he's staying. What?
Yeah. No, he decided, and it actually turned out to be a really good decision. He decided that our youngest child is very, very, very introverted, and convincing her that she could leave the house long enough to go to college was a big endeavor. And he said, look, if we move away, she'll be homeless. And I'm like, she won't be homeless. What are you talking about? And he said, no, she will feel homeless because it's the only house she's ever lived in. And she's going to come home on the weekends. And if we move, she's going to think she's homeless. I was like, well, you should have told me that before you told me to apply to Harvard. And so we decided that what I would.
So was this? I want to ask, was this, like you say, it was a good decision in the hindsight, and it feels to me like maybe he realized that, well, they both need me to think I'm going to go. So I'm just going to let her like keep going down this path of getting into Harvard and accepting and being totally committed before I inform her that, like, actually, you're going to make it. You're going to be okay, Krista. But
Yeah, it was a crazy thing. And so it really we decided that I had to be in residence for the first 2 years. And then after that, it's like a little bit negotiable, right? So that's for the first 2 years, basically we would commute. So I would go for the fall semester, which was 12 weeks. He would come for 2 weeks around our anniversary, which was right in the middle, which in hindsight, also, it's not very helpful for your husband to show up during midterms, but it's a separate issue. And then I would come home for the breaks, right? And then in the spring, we would meet up on a beach somewhere for spring vacation. So that was the plan. And it was totally
good plan.
It was a great plan. But then, Harvard kicked my ass, and it was just not the most viable. It was not the most viable plan. Yeah, but it was, so it meant, so then this is how you know that you're at midlife. So my mom died right during that spring when we were making this transition. And it was at the exact moment when I was supposed to pick housing, right? So there was just way too much chaos in my life. So I ended up in the graduate school dorm with a bunch of 25-year-old men from around the world who clearly were very picky. And that's what happened. That's how I ended up there. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I like how that is a midlife story, because it was not full of daring do and intrigue so much as like, well, this isn't going to work, so we're going to go over here. That's not working. But but you're in the dorm, so all right. What is that like? I mean, first impressions. Who's there? Like, do you feel like you fit in?
Well, the first thing is that August and September in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's about 700 degrees, right? It's usually like in the 90, 95 degrees, and the humidity is always over 85, 90% humidity, right? So it's just a sweat box. And there's no air conditioning, and there's no fan. And they say to me, I had picked this dorm based on this brochure that they sent me. And let me just say, the photos were not of the dorm. They were of the apartment building across the street. So I walk in, and my room is 9 by 9, which is, by the way, smaller than the average prison cell. So, and there's no cooling of any kind. And I say to the guy who runs the dorm, who was like, the same age as my middle child. And I'm like, air conditioning? He's like, oh, you know, we don't have air conditioning and you don't really need it. And I'm like, it's 107 degrees in this room. And he's like, well, winter will be here soon enough and then it'll be cold.
Yes, and then you're going to be asking, where's the heat, right? So quit bothering us right now.
Yeah. So I lived in this little room. I did have the wisdom to pay the extra $80 a month or whatever to have a suite. So I had a private bathroom that I shared with one other woman who was from Myanmar. And she was really super interesting and very nice. And then, the rest, like there are all these single rooms and they're all occupied. They're mostly occupied by, 25-year-olds who really had two characteristics. Either they're coming out of their bachelor's degree program and they had never not lived in the dorm. So, it's just another year of school for them. But a lot of them were actually master's degree students from other countries. And they were at the School of Design, the Kennedy
Right.
School, or the Education School. And many of them were very, very interesting people. There was an architect from Mexico City who was just a delightful human being. There was a judge. Honestly, there's a judge from Ethiopia who's at the Kennedy School whose name was Solomon. Uh, Solomon and I got to be good friends.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, but you never wanted to go into the kitchen or the communal bathrooms because ew.
Well, so okay, it's just fascinating to think about. Where are the Harvard people, though? I mean, did you meet any of, or in this collection at the dorms? I guess maybe that's not where you look for them, but I'm imagining like you need to have people whose great grandfather went to Harvard, and or people who went to some, I've been climbing the American academic ladder and this is the pinnacle of their career and they're going to launch and discover the third moon of Endor. I don't know, right? But it sounds like it's,
well,
that's not the cast of characters you're describing.
The legacies are at the business school and the law school. And I'm probably an FAS, which is the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. So that would be where your physicists would be, but I didn't meet any of them. I did meet a young woman whom I adore. She teaches at, I think, Eastern Michigan now. And she was from Yemen. She is from Yemen. And she had this incredibly interesting legacy story. Her parents were from Yemen, but for whatever reason, they were living in Ethiopia. And so her father applied to Harvard for undergrad, and they had given him a full ride scholarship to come to Harvard to study genetics. And so he was about to go off to Harvard, and he couldn't afford an airplane ticket. And
oh man.
Yeah. So, and Harvard wouldn't pay for the airplane ticket to bring him from Ethiopia. And so he didn't go. He had to go back to Yemen and go to the National University in Yemen. And so when she got into Harvard, he was just like, he had fulfilled all of her dreams and he thought it was like closing the circle. I was like, this is a crazy story. Why didn't they buy you an airplane ticket?
Uh-huh. You're getting to go to college for me. This is wonderful.
I thought it was just really generous on his part because I would have been like really mad. But yeah, I'm sure those students are out there. But honestly, you like it's the 1% of the 1%, and it was, in that sense, it was a really great learning experience to really come to understand how the 1% is structured and how those lines are sort of demarcated, and certainly you do not have
How?
legacies
Give
in
me
the
an example of the first time you were. What's an example when you first come across this, or how you started to learn? Hey, this isn't, these aren't the kids from back home. These are the
uh,
1%.
well, I mean, I think the first time I really started to understand it was at the end of my first year. Um, and the Boston bombing had happened. And what's important about that is that there's a street that runs from Cambridge to Watertown, called St. Auburn Street. It actually runs really a lot longer than that. It's like a main thoroughfare that follows the river. And like my dorm backed up to St. Albert Street. What's important about that is that, and then it separated the dorm from the Kennedy School. And what's important about that is that St. Auburn Street is the street that the bombers took from MIT to Watertown, which is where the big, showdown was. And they had dumped a bunch of explosives on St. Auburn Street as part of that getaway. So like everybody was very much locked down, like you were not going anywhere during that period of time. So that was not too much before graduation. So a
Wow.
couple weeks before graduation, this email went out that said, if you or your family have a private security detail attending graduation, you must register your private security detail with Harvard Police.
Right. And woo, yeah. And did that seem like real? Like when you're talking about, oh, do you have a private security detail? I mean, clearly you weren't like, oh yeah, like Jimmy does. Like somebody that out there did it, right? But not your roommate from Myanmar.
No, not me or my roommate from Myanmar. But, eventually I did. I took some classes at the law school and at the Kennedy School, and I did meet students. Like, these people don't show up in education, okay? They show up in other fields. I did meet some, children of heads of state. I met, actually, at the Kennedy School, I met a couple of people who were actually, like, in sitting administrations in other countries, and they'd taken a year off to come and do a particular master's program at the Kennedy School. So like I met like the Secretary of Education from Brazil, and those kinds of folks. And then I did, not too long after that, during graduation week, I was walking down the street past the law school, and there's this big building. It's like a big white marble building, as you would expect at the law school, and it sits against the street, so it's like a block long. So there's this block where there's parking for the law school that's like drop off zone for the, and I was walking past that, and it was just black SUV after black SUV after lined up in front of the law school, and
Yeah.
all these guys in chauffeur uniforms, who were undoubtedly armed, milling around in front of the law school. And I thought, so like, I guess if I just spend more time here, then I would find the people with their
Right.
private, security details. Yeah, there's a lot of money there, right? There was this big article in the New York Times that came out my first year. And, one of the things that was surprising to other students at the dorm, but not at all surprising to me, is that about 50%, what the article said was that 50% of students at the business school will never have a job. That the reason that they come to Harvard Business School is to learn to
Wow.
manage their family fortunes.
Whoa, that's amazing. That's it. Well, let's balance that with, okay, so this is Harvard, and I think of it as being like the fount of like a lot of what we'd call the academy, right? Like of intellectual leadership, thought leadership, whatever you want to call it, in the United States and the world. And it's it's a former Puritan minister's training school, as I recall. So I mean, it's also like the epitome of like the New England culture. in the United States. And did you feel that when you're studying there? I mean, did you feel like, oh, I'm learning the ways of the academy, or did you pick up on the people on the other side of the aisle from you and I often rail against the academy and the elite Ivy League set? I mean, do you feel like, are you indoctrinated when you got your doctorate? That's what I want to know.
I was not indoctrinated, but in some ways, not in those ways. Yes and no. It is like a PhD is professional training, and they are training you to think in a particular way. And I was really bad at it. There is a scholar at the ed school named Jack Shonkoff, and Jack is a really interesting character. I think people in Washington probably know him because he was really involved in the establishment of the Department of Early Learning, which now has been changed. But he's really a big part of that whole early learning movement, and was really a big leader of it for a variety of reasons. Anyway, Jack teaches a class, and I took this class where he basically says there are three roles to be played. If you really want to change the world, there are three roles. So one role is that you're a researcher. One role is that you're a policymaker and you do policy work. And then the third role is really like a translation role where you're engaging the public in the work. And he talks about how you really have to sort of pick a lane and you really have to stay in it. And it doesn't work very well to cross those lanes. And he would say to me pretty regularly, he would ask me a question and I would answer, and he would say, "That is a policy answer. What is the research answer?" I just failed and failed and failed and failed. And eventually, I had an advisor on my committee who had been he was a special educator, and he had he was like the head of special education in Boston and then in Chicago. And then he got tapped by Judy Heumann actually to go to DC and be in the Clinton administration working on special ed. So he's like the director of special education or something inside the Department of Education. It was a congressional appointment, so he had to do the hearings and everything. He's got great stories. And he wrote the most recent version of IDEA, and has great stories about like when the staffer that he worked with is actually Elena Kagan back when she worked in the Senate, right? So like it was just like these crazy connections, and which is really how the Northeast culture and Puritan culture really works. It's like this network, right? And so he it's towards the end, I would sit in his office and I would cry and I would say, Tom, like, I thought that I come here for 7 years and I would think like a researcher, and still people ask me questions, and the first toolbox that I reach into every single time is always a policy toolbox. I don't reach first to the research toolbox. Right. So I was not properly indoctrinated, to answer your question. I should have been. And
this is a sad story. I thought it was going to be.
I was a disappointment to all.
I thought that was going to have a happy end. Dang. Well, okay. How do you feel about your education, though? I mean, you're Dr. Krista, right? You're like a legit expert.
Yeah, it's Dr. Badass to you.
Is it? Oh yes. I'm sorry, Dr. Badass. Was it worth it? Looking back right now, how do you feel about your jumping into the pool?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways I think it's great. Like, there's a whole world that like opened up that I didn't even know was. I mean, I did, but I didn't. During my time there, I had the opportunity to like travel to Spain and travel to Brazil and to Sweden and Denmark, which, something I just always talked about in my West Coast life, like, oh, we should go to these places, we should, whatever. But it's actually easier to go to Europe from Boston than it is to go back to Seattle. So like this whole eastward looking world opened up to me, right? Yeah. So, I always thought that like going to graduate school like, so I set some goals when I was starting, and I was like, okay, I want this to sort of set up the second half of life. So I guess at some level I realized it was midlife. I didn't think of it as a crisis, right? It didn't seem like a midlife crisis. Graduating felt like a crisis. But yeah, it just opened up all these new possibilities and ways of thinking that I just never imagined before. And some of that, it's really still hard to sort out. Some of that may be because the kids are grown and they're all through college. Like my daughter graduated way before I did, right? It's hard to know. Like, is it the phase of life? Is it the education? Is it the people that I met? Is it? But I definitely think like the biggest thing that I took away was just learning to say yes a lot more. Just, saying yes. If somebody says there's a conference in Brazil and you should really go, just figuring out how you do that. Instead of like defaulting to that sounds expensive. No, thank you. Yeah.
Right. Well, but how do you say yes to that? Because I'm totally identifying with you. Like when you're like, let's go to do something awesome, whatever. In Brazil, I think 98% of us would be like, sorry, I don't live in Brazil. So what's underneath your change of mindset there?
That's a fascinating question. I think in some ways there's a lot of pressure not to say no. I mean, I think that is one of the things about being in a system that's so incredibly wealthy is that there's no imagination in that system for saying no, right? Of course, you'll figure it out. Get a credit card, dude. Like, like there's definitely like money isn't an object. It is this weird, like money is no object, and yet the school is always talking about how poor it is, and how much money they lost in the crash, and you know it's just this weird thing. But you're supposed to say yes. You're always supposed to say yes. You're never supposed to say no. You just figure it out. You're just supposed to figure it out. And sometimes I did, and sometimes I didn't. And sometimes I wish I hadn't. But you know, yeah.
But is it a positive then? Like, saying, do you find that you're happier having learned to say yes?
Yeah. That is definitely a cool part. I think some of it is that it's just expected that when you wave your diploma around, that someone will hire you. So you're always going to land. As my first advisor said to me before she left Harvard, Harvard's a great place to be from, right? So you just like there is a certain like square your shoulders and be confident, and someone's going to hire you, and life is an adventure ethic.
Well, yeah.
There's also a work hard. People work ridiculously hard. And
Yeah.
like we came from the Senate, and that was like crazy hard work.
Yeah, man.
And I think
burning the candle at both ends.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I think I'm a little bit old for that. I mean, that's one thing that I did learn is that I was a little bit old for being able to keep up with that pace. I think a lot of what academia requires of people is that you come out of the box at this pace that is insane and unsustainable. And you do that for 10 or 12 years, and then like you can slow down and you have minions to overwork on your behalf. I'm too old for that pathway.
yeah,
I'm just too old for that pathway. I just can't write fast enough.
Yeah, that's it.
Think
Well,
fast enough. I can't work that hard. I just can't do it.
my wife and I were having a conversation. I know we gotta be mindful of the time, but we were having a conversation about interns and whether or not, she has a lot to do. It's like, well, maybe they're going to get me an intern. And they're talking about, well, we could get you an unpaid intern. And she's like, what? But it was like this, like, is that even ethical? But it's a thing. I was like, I remember doing an unpaid internship, but it's this kind of machine that expects you to, if you, especially I assume in the office work culture that we're part of, white collar work, you start out getting no money or be working ridiculous hours. But the idea is that there's this lopsided system, and someday you're going to be on the other side of it where things are good and the little munchkins are running around doing your bidding.
Yeah. I believe I learned that the name for that is late stage capitalism.
Okay, yeah, you and my wife should have a conversation because that comes up a lot. But all right, in the time we have left, though, I want to ask you first of all, most importantly, so how do we make sure that kids go to school? What was the answer?
Oh, the answer is that it's a developmental process that begins maybe as early as preschool, possibly, certainly by the time of kindergarten, and that kids have to feel like they belong. And there are groups of children for whom belonging is a very difficult challenge. And so we really need to get better at schools being a place that help kids actually go through the attachment process. So learning to co-regulate, having opportunities to co-regulate emotions with adults and those kinds of things. But most importantly, kids have to feel seen and like they belong, right? And so it's interesting that one of the things that really rose to the top in my research was this idea of receiving positive feedback for effort as well as accomplishment. So it's really important, especially for vulnerable kids, to acknowledge in positive terms when they've made an effort, when they've done small things that we didn't expect them to be able to do or that are very hard for them. I did a study inside a prison, and there was this one young guy who said to me, you know, he had been placed in special education for behavioral disability, and he's like, I love that classroom. And I was like, well, why? And he said, because every day my teacher would ask me, like, how are you? And if I missed class, she would say, I missed you. Where were you? And he said it would have been really embarrassing to say, oh, I skipped your class to smoke pot behind the building, and so I would go to class instead, right? And he said, really, like, I know you're just supposed to do your work and no one should congratulate you for showing up and like doing something really easy, but I really needed that. And I think that's true. All kids really need that, but especially kids who are coming from environments where home is really tough, community is really tough, and the world around them is not saying, hey, you belong here and you're doing a good job and we're glad to see you and I missed you when you weren't here. Like, school has to fill that gap, and it's free. Like, that's free. That's free.
But at the risk of sending us down a rabbit hole, like nothing you're saying here is like, I guess what I would think of as like classically academic. You're not saying it's reading, writing, arithmetic, test scores, algebraic thinking. I mean, you're talking about belonging and learning to regulate emotions and being welcomed and affirmed for effort as opposed to outcomes. I mean,
well, belonging is actually the source of motivation. So, yeah, I mean, those skills are important. And I mean, this was not part of my dissertation, but it's definitely something that's out there, which is that, kids need to be reading fluently by age 10. So, if we ever have to organize our budgets so that there's just not enough money to do everything. My personal feeling is put all the money in to make sure that every child is reading fluently by age 10. Period. Full stop.
Okay. That's the whole thing.
That's a whole thing. Yeah, and sure, like for some kids it's really easy and natural, but for a lot of kids it's not. And for a lot of kids, especially kids who are experiencing trauma and violence in their own homes, reading is something that gets disrupted in interesting ways. It makes it difficult to learn to read. Like reading is an interesting thing because it's based almost strictly on prediction. It's not natural to read. And so the way that we learn to read is that our eyes actually cascade across a line of text, and our brain is working to predict what's going to happen next. That's why we have spelling tests, so that like we can recognize words really quickly. So we read across. But if you come from an environment where nothing's predictable, where it's chaos, and where your behavior, it doesn't matter if your behavior is good, you get in trouble. If your behavior is bad, you get in trouble. Where maybe there's food, maybe there's not food. Not having an ability to predict what comes next is actually really profoundly affects learning to read. So,
wow.
It really does come back to meeting the developmental and meeting the developmental needs of kids, like ensuring that their basic needs are met, ensuring that they have that they're not deprived. So there's kind of this move away from talking about child abuse and neglect. Neglect as a thing is moving towards being talked about as deprivation, where kids.
Okay.
So humans come into the world and we're all wired for certain things. Like we're wired for language. Why did you learn to speak English? Why did I learn to speak English even though I lived in Germany? It's because that's what was spoken to us, right? So that's an experience-dependent developmental phenomenon. All the humans are born able to acquire language, and we acquire language through experience. And so that's why kids who live in Brazil learn Portuguese or one of the native languages that's common in Portugal. It's why in Brazil, or it's why Italian kids learn to speak Italian, right? It's because it's experience dependent. And so increasingly we're thinking about child neglect as being deprivation of those experiences that are necessary in order to develop those experience dependent phenomena. So that does mean having people who speak to you, having people who make eye contact with you, having people who touch babies and hold babies and respond to them when they cry, making sure that there's food, that there is, that there are clean diapers to be changed into, guidance as kids get older, right? Some guardrails so that they're not doing crazy, self-injurious things as toddlers. All of those kinds of things actually do add up to building the foundation that makes it possible for our brains to develop as they move forward, right? Those things sit more in the back, reading sits more in the front, for example, as you move forward in the brain. So it's all connected because the little people are actually, they're whole people. Right?
That is a darn lie, but okay.
I know you have little ones, right?
Well,
they demand a lot.
That's right. I know what you're talking about. They aren't. No, how about this? Because you kind of brought it up, but by way of wrapping things up, what about growing up where you did and how you did has influenced this whole experience we've been talking about going back and getting your doctorate?
Wow, that is a super great question. So, both of my parents passed away while I was in graduate school. My mom right before I started, my dad right before I graduated. And so that is an incredible midlife experience, but it's
Yeah.
also, an occasion for
Yeah.
reflecting on how you got here. And uh, uh, I will say that my parents were both pretty hard driving. And they always wanted me to go to Harvard. I got accepted, a few weeks before my mom died, and then when I came home when she was dying, I brought all the stuff that Harvard sends you with the
Mm.
folder and the letters and the embossed stamps and all that stuff that's so pretty. And and I gave it to her, and she said, finally, you're going to do something to realize your potential.
It's about time you made good, Krista.
Yeah. So she died happy with me. She's like, finally, you're going to do what you're supposed to do. So,
That's great. That's wonderful that you could tie that up, though. I mean,
yeah. Yeah.
all right. So how do people keep track of you? I don't know if you're considered a public person. Certainly, you do public policy work, but do we need to know your Twitter handle? Do we need to know where we're going to see you on C-SPAN? What's going on?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Well, I do have a Twitter handle, but my Twitter is I need you, Adam, to help me figure out how to be a social media personality.
But never mind. Yeah.
My
Okay.
Twitter
Well, it's
is just Goldstine Cole. So that's easy to find. What am I doing? I don't know. I am supposed to be writing stuff for publication. So I would say, in the next couple years, look for my book tour. When it's time for my book tour, maybe I'll call you up and we can chat
ooh,
about
that is a deal. I would love it. Yes.
it. And then maybe I'll be covered.
Well, think that you will be. It'll all have started here. Remember.
Hey, thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining me. And it's been a lot of fun, and I hope we do get to do it again. And it's been wonderful hearing what you have to say.
Thanks. It was fun.